Right, according to the ONS, there are approximately 60,000 vacancies in the construction and real estate sectors right now. At the start of the pandemic, I can tell you, there were 11,000 vacancies. So more than a 5-fold increase. What it means, of course, is that attracting and keeping employees is as important as ever. So how best to go about that? This session, employee inspiration, attraction and retention, are you offering what your workforce wants, aims to answer that question with the help of an expert in the field. Please welcome from the consultancy All in Works, Peter Flade.
Hi there. So I thought in the kind of half hour that we have, we'd try and cover 3 things. So 1, why does this topic matter? 2, bring your defense that no matter how you approach this, there's so much you can do right now within your organizations. And then finally, think a little bit about how you might play your offense. But let's start with why this matters so much. And if I could all ask you to stand up, please. Oh, that was slow. Really slow. Okay, I'd like you to think of a ladder, please, where 10 is the best possible life you could imagine for yourself, and 0 is the worst possible life you could imagine for yourself. I'm going to ask you 2 questions. On which rung of the ladder you currently stand, and on which rung of the ladder you think you'll stand in 5 years' time. Thinking only of now, where 10 is the best possible and 0 is the worst possible life you could imagine for yourself. If for now you rate it between a 0 and a 4, please sit down. That really helps, because this can kind of bleed into a therapy session otherwise. If you rate now a 5 or a 6, please sit down. That's quite rare, actually. A 7? An 8. That felt like peer pressure that everybody else sat down there. But okay, that's really good though. Okay, this is something called the Cantrell self-anchoring rating system. It just flows off the tongue. It's something that was developed back in the 60s, but has been used for the last 15 years as part of something that the Gallup poll has been asking a representative sample of the Earth's population. And if you think almost about personal well-being, there's a continuum. On one side, it's kind of how we rate our lives, and on the other side, it's how we experience our lives. This is closer to how we rate our life. And they've done this now for 15 years, and what they're finding is there's really 3 ways you could segment people, populations across the world. Kind of, if right now you score between a 0 and a 4, and you don't think it will be better in 5 years' time, then you're in the suffering category. And around the world, about 13% of people are identified in the suffering category. Now, straight out of the gate, there's a strong correlation between per capita GDP and the way that you rate this. If you're desperately poor, you're more likely to be in the suffering category. The majority of people are in this struggling category, and that's when you score now a 5 or a 6, and again, you don't think it will be better in 5 years' time. But finally, if you're a 7 now, and you think it's an 8 or more in 5 years' time, you're in the thriving category, where most things are working for you, most things are happening in life. Now, if you start looking on the other end of the continuum about the way we describe, like what happened yesterday, did you experience joy or anger? Do you feel safe around your home? Have you been hungry on 3 or more occasions in the last month? It gets closer to how you actually experience life. And 5 things come out. And I'll leave number 1 last. The second is social. So are you with people who love you and hopefully that you love you back? Can you spend enough time with them? The third is actually financial. And if you're not desperately poor, the most important factor there is knowing where your income is coming from. It's less about absolute earnings if you're not desperately poor. 4th is health. And 5th is community. So how involved you are with something that's bigger than your immediate family, even friends. It's, do you volunteer, do you give blood, something bigger than yourself. So very important, but number 1 across the world is purpose. Now, purpose, undoubtedly, you can do that if you're with a pension and you're finding things to occupy yourself. You can be a full-time parent, and there's huge purpose. But for many people, that does translate into work. And so if work is not fulfilling, if something is wrong with work, it's that much harder to be thriving in your life. You kind of slink into this struggling or sometimes even suffering category when it's wrong. So there's a huge human dimension to this, person by person, that work in your organizations. There's, of course, also a financial piece to it. And there's a big meta-analysis that's been going now for some 20 years of millions of employees, thousands of business units, trying to look at what differentiates between these teams in different industries, different companies. And what you find is that when there's high levels of engagement, and this is really everything I'll tell you now is top quartile, the top 25% versus the bottom 25%. When you're in that top 25% versus the bottom, in high labor turnover organizations, so that's kind of 40% plus labor turnover a year, there's an 18% difference. You're 18% more likely to stay if you're engaged at work. If you're in a lower labor turnover organization, less than 40% labor turnover a year, it's over 40%. Some big differences right there. But think about this other piece as well, around productivity. So I don't know if you follow this, or I find it fascinating, but productivity has been on the wane in the West for about 20 years. So it's kind of averaging about 1.5% a year productivity growth, which is a crying shame. When 5 of us are more productive next year than we were this year, there's more wealth, all sorts of good things happen. When you're kind of static year after year, it's very difficult. The UK, as you probably read, really suffers from this. Right now, we have negligible productivity growth. It's less than 1%. Back to the analogy between the most and the least engaged teams. The most versus the least are 18% more productive. Now, most of what drives productivity is very big things. It's like the NHS, it's education, it's aggregate demand. It's things that we as individuals, even as companies, have very little impact on. We're almost on the shoulders of giants who came before us. But think right there, if you get that kind of miserable group of people, move them up that continuum, there's so much unlocked productivity, let alone the chances that they'll stay with you. So both financially, in terms of impact, but also on a human level, it really matters. So what can you do? Let's think a little bit about the kind of defense first, and think of yourselves as leaders, senior leaders within your organization. You have a huge impact on whether people stay or not. So when we look at different employee surveys, it's one of the strongest correlations, one of the strongest links is how they think about senior leaders and whether they want to quit their organization or not. It can seem crazy because as senior leaders, you might be very distant. I don't see you very often. But somehow it percolates down to the organization. To the point, and not purely data, it's kind of qualitative and data. I think senior leaders are the culture of an organization. So how you show up and what you value has a huge impact on how we feel day in, day out. One little stat. If people give a 5, a top box to, I trust my senior leaders, there's a better than 1 in 2 chance they're engaged at work. Anything less than a 5, not a 1 or a 2, anything less than a 5, it falls to 1 in 12. So it's almost binary. So think about that. Do they know you? Do they know what you're about? Do they trust you? It might not be that you're a dodgy character. They just might not see you a lot. To give this some credence and to kind of bring it down, I tried to think about if there was one thing I could give you as senior leaders in your organizations to think about, it would be listen. Listen in every discussion you have, when you go on a site visit, as well as preaching the gospel, telling them about the exciting plans you're after. Try and really listen. And I'd like you to do that. So find the person who's sitting next to you. So you two. Don't be shy about this. And I'd like you for 1 minute, one of you, to share something that you really like in life and why you like it. You've only got 1 minute. And the other person, you've then got 30 seconds to paraphrase, bring it back, much as you're doing all day, kind of a summary of what did you hear? What is the essence of what they said? And then we'll flip it on its head. So everybody's got their pair? I know you've been excited to do this all day. You have a minute starting now. Go. Okay, let's bring it back to the room. It's such an important skill to develop, because I could go on and on about coaching, going out in town hall meetings and listening as well as delivering. But at the very heart of it is giving somebody that undivided attention, in some way mirroring their intensity, their body language, sometimes even welcoming silence. Oh gosh, leaders, it kills leaders. You know, they have to fill in the gaps. Just wait for that silence. Somebody is thinking before you take it further. But so if you think about defense, I'd really start with that. Is you first and foremost as a leader, how do you go out? How do you show up? The second thing, of course, is that managers matter. They matter so much. I wish it wasn't so much, because there's a lot of not so good managers out there. The truth is, most managers out there are pretty average. And there's some dreadful ones who were put on God's sweet earth to do anything but manage other people. But we are where we are. Think a little bit about this. I remember many years ago, we were working with Skanska UK, a Swedish construction company in the UK. And one of the gentlemen around the table had just finished the construction of the Gherkin building in London. And I can imagine offers were flying in left, right, and center. And so the question was, why do you stay? Why do you stay with Skanska UK? It was this kind of burly chap. He stands up and kind of points over there. And it was his manager. And they'd worked together for 17 years at Skanska, done all sorts of things, and was kind of, I thought it was quite moving, but you know, they were a bit embarrassed. But as your managers go, so go your people, so go their engagement. Some research that looks team by team says that 70% of the variance, the difference between levels of engagement, is just down to the manager. There's another study that shows, if you look at outcomes, that the quality of the manager is more important than that individual's talent or even the team around them, the colleagues around them. It's just crazy numbers. Everything is multiplied or constricted by the quality of that manager. So if there's something you need to get right in your organization, if you really want to hold on to your people, get your managers right. And it's very difficult. Sometimes people become managers because there was no other way to go. If there's not another kind of course or career track, I'll become a manager. It's not really what I'm about. I'm so competitive. I compete against my children, let alone my team. Probably not always the best place to be a manager. But try and get that right. To the point that we've been studying this for 22 years. If someone's got a bad manager, there's almost nothing else I can do to make it okay at work. I can look at pay and conditions, and leaders can do some nice things around culture. I just can't make up for it when there's that really bad manager. And then the final thing, which I think really we need to think about in terms of defense, it's not what people think of day in, day out, but when they stand back, think a little bit about where am I going? It's opportunities to grow. And where somebody is growing and there's development and it's a bit crazy and we're not always sure around expectations, you can really keep people's interest. When that flatlines, when that development, that growth has kind of stopped, again, at some point, how do you make up for it? I got a good manager, there's good leaders in this place, you know, my job is okay, but I'm the same as I was last year. There's one organization based in the UK that has average tenure of only 3 years, so 36 months. And we looked at some of the data that they had, and people who had one career change, so not always a promotion, sometimes a demotion, but some kind of career change. I'm doing something different. On average, they nearly doubled their tenure to 60 months. So it was just, I've got to do something different. It's boring to be stuck in again and again. Think broadly about all the different ways that you can grow your people, through coaching, through feedback, through mirroring somebody else. But it's just got to be part of your defense all the time. Because when people have opportunities, when they stand back and think about their career, when they speak to others, if that's missing, I wouldn't bet that they would stay for too long. So some thoughts there about defense. Now let's think a little bit about offense. How can you go out into the market and really think about how you attract people? And to help with this, again, in your groups, 2s, 3s, 4s, spend a couple of minutes and think in your organization. And for now, let's think about managers. Think about really good managers. Maybe you're thinking of 1 or 2. What are the qualities? What is it about them that differentiates them from good people who just struggle in the role? So not dodgy, they don't do crazy stuff. They just suck at managing people. And you sent them on courses, you spent time with them, and we kind of come back to it again. Just think, what are the one or two things that differentiate the best from strugglers in the management positions in your organization? A couple of minutes, go. Okay, let's bring it back to the room. I don't want to interrupt, but it's just I'm on the clock. Please shout out one or two things that came out from your discussion. Shout it loud and proud. They create a sense of purpose. Beautiful. Non-arrogant. So they trust their people. The opposite of micromanaging, right? Adaptable. Okay. You see, almost always what comes off straight off the bat is personal qualities. But let me ask you this. If you look at future performance, what's more important, experience or potential? So objectively, which is better at forecasting future performance, experience or potential? Okay, it's potential. What do we almost always hire for? Almost always we hire for experience. Now, my friends, I understand we're in the real world, and sometimes I have no time. So if I'm boarding a plane, I don't want to go with somebody who's a very talented future pilot, but has only flown a few hours. Wonderful talent. I'll wait those years until that experience is under their belt. But think about this. If we constantly go for experience, we're letting ourselves down in two ways. First of all, in many, many studies, experience is shown to predict 3% of future performance. Nothing. Take something like maybe intelligence tests or structured interviews. It can be 30% of future performance. Now we're getting to some real predictive power. Combine those things, intelligence tests maybe and structured interviews, you can get 57% predictive power of will this person succeed here or not. So really think about potential. And now if that's one thing to get it right because it's fair, you can actually predict it in a meaningful way, you can also open up the door to maybe people you haven't normally hired. Because if we're always going for experience, I'm always going to get a certain type of person. They might go to the same schools or hang out in the same places. There's a certain background that I'm looking for. If you put that aside and suddenly now it's about personal qualities, you can start fishing in pools where maybe your competitors are not. So this is not just diversity as some kind of abstract concept. I can win by finding people who are as equally able to have some of these wonderful qualities that I'm after. So maybe it's that I don't micromanage some of the things that you talked about, but I can go to pools where other people are not. Think about this. Adam gets 4 interviews for every 1 interview that Mohammed gets when they have identical CVs. In London. I don't want to even think what this is outside of London. This is one of the most cosmopolitan places in the world. Can you imagine what it might be elsewhere? I don't know through data. My gut tells me it's even worse. So imagine if I go where Mohammed is, if I understand maybe what he's looking for, and I'm looking for those qualities, I'm going for the best people. I've suddenly opened up a completely different pool because I'm doing it on the basis of talent and potential. Now, maybe you need, if you have fast growth, yes, I need that experience as well, but at some point, try and get the balance right. My suggestion, make internal hires, talent hires, your default setting. Now, if there's a certain reason, I understand that you don't take it, but that's where I think you've got to go to attract and win in different ways when you have such tight labor markets. You know, so much of talking about labor participation rate going down during the pandemic, mostly that's coming from the States. It hasn't happened so much here. So we actually have quite high labor participation. It's around 78%. It's around 79% in Germany. It's around 67% in the United States. And so much of what we read is coming from there. Every 1 extra percentage points in the States is millions of people. It's not quite the same here. So we have to make do with the labor force we have. We left a certain international organization a few years ago, so we've kind of closed that door as well. I won't bring that up. Okay. So the other thing that I'd say is really think about how you hire. I mean, you'll have heard bits and pieces of this, but hire for talent. Give people a work sample. You know, come and test them. Give them a week, a month, a day, an hour, so you can kind of see how they react, how your organization is. blind the heck out of your CVs. And maybe most important, if you're serious about this, you need to have minority and women candidates on your bench. Now, I'm going to end on a controversial one. You may have seen this. There's a 2016 study which showed that if in your finalists you only have 1 woman, and say there's 2, 3, 4 guys going for the same role, statistically, what are the chances that you're going to hire her? 0. 0. It's 3 studies in this study. You can throw things at me, etc., but they did 3 studies in this. If there's just 1 woman candidate in a bench of 2, 3, or 4, 3, 4, or 5, where all the rest are men, you don't hire. If suddenly there's 2 women on the bench, now suddenly the chances of hiring goes up 79%. And they found generally the same with minority candidates as well. So really upend your recruitment. You're going to get better people straight out. And then maybe you can also start fishing in this diversity pool where suddenly all sorts of exciting opportunities work out for you to win and, by the way, make the world a better place. So kind of in summation, right now the UK has to a degree a fixed labor pool, high labor participation rate, low productivity and not getting any better. And by the way, our engagement numbers are not so good. Europe is not so good. I think the Germans say, God holidays in France. God surely doesn't work in Europe if you look at the engagement results. It's not great. And so if you almost look at, we've got as many people roughly as we're going to have in our labor force right now. Engagement is low, and if we get it right, we get all sorts of things like retention and productivity growth. I think it's a very natural way to go. Thanks very much.